You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch Radio.
Hello everyone! Yes, it's really me. It's not a replay. It is going to be a recording of a show, but it's a brand new show. It's me, I'm back. Penny G. Morgan, back from my holidays to the north of France, to Normandy, and all things history and D-Day. Yeah. I know Kerry said when she did her sort of roundup on Monday of what all the shows are going to be about, that I had a weird experience. I had quite a lot of weird experiences out there, which I'm sure I'll tell you about or I'll write about at some time. But when you're sitting in an old farmer's cottage that's probably nigh on 500-600 years old, and you're just sitting there watching television with your husband, and a bag flies off the table, sort of in the middle of the cottage, if that makes sense, and there's no windows open, there's no nothing, you do start to ask a few questions as to what's going on. Hi Emma, thanks for joining us. So, what's everyone else been up to? I won't keep the intro going for too long, because I know most of you will be waiting to hear all about Jack the Ripper, or anyone who's ever watched Spinal Tap, and please tell me someone here has seen Spinal Tap. Saucy Jack. If you haven't seen Spinal Tap, that won't make any sense to you whatsoever. But if you have seen Spinal Tap, you'll know it's to do with the musical they said that they were going to be writing for the West End. At the end, all about Jack the Ripper. Yeah, anyway. One of the things I do want to say before I do the show, and I'm going to say the normal stuff, like if you haven't followed us, subscribe to our YouTube channel, go on, do it, because you're going to hear all about the shows. You get to hear all the shows and everything else on there. Don't forget, we've got the Sharing is Caring event going on in May of next year. If you go along to our website, have a look at that. Have a look at all the blogs that we've been writing. I know the one I wrote on Chernobyl went up whilst I was away, actually. Paul Rook kindly put it up whilst I was away. So there's loads of things going on. But what I will say is about Jack the Ripper, and I will reiterate this when I'm talking to Mike later, is that one of my bugbears about this is the fact that people seem to forget he was a nasty, vicious killer. And even if you don't sort of agree exactly how many women he killed, those five women, hi Kerry, thanks for that, my love. Those 5 women that he killed, Marianne Nichols, also known as Polly, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, they were people. And what I do want to do is, as I'm talking, you may think I'm being flippant, you may think I'm being sort of joking about these people, but I promise you I'm not. These were real women who had their lives snatched away from them. So do keep that in mind when you're thinking about Jack the Ripper and any questions that you're asking. But without further ado, I think I'm going to start the interview. So bear with me. And hello everybody. And for my first show back from my 2 weeks holiday, I thought I'd do one that most people will never have heard of. This character, this murderer that nobody's ever heard of, and he hasn't got a reputation. Nobody's interested in him, but I thought I'd bring him to your attention. Yeah, I'm just being sarcastic. Of course, everyone's heard of Jack the Ripper. And most people have also heard of my wonderful guest, Mr. Mike Covell from Hull. How are you doing, Mike?
From Hull. I'm all right, thank you.
Good. The reason we were laughing is we were having a little conversation just beforehand about exactly how Mike's surname is pronounced. It's not exactly a difficult surname, but I maintained it was Covell, and other people have told me, no, it's Covell, Covell, and... apparently I was right. It is Covell.
Yeah, so, well, there's lots of different ways to say it, but I'm quite easygoing, so I don't have a particular type, but that sounds good to me. So
just say she's right, Mike.
Sorry.
Just say Penny is right.
Penny is right.
That's right. There you go. We're friends for life now. Anyone who tells me I'm right about stuff. You know, I don't like to be wrong. But anyway, Jack the Ripper. Now, you're one of those infamous ripperologists,
yes.
Aren't you, Mr. C?
I certainly am, yeah. I really began my fascination with the case when I was about 8.
Wow.
My dad had a book about unsolved murders and mysteries, and I sat reading it, and that was the one case that really jumped out. And I think it was the name more than anything. And you know, most kids would ask for stuff for Christmas, like bikes and, you know, games consoles, but I was quite happy to get books about Jack the Ripper and ghosts and UFOs and things like that. And when I was in college, I had a full-time job as well as going to college. So my book collection kind of increased rapidly. And then when I moved out of home and got my own place, I had a spare room, so it became a Ripper room, really. And it just really spiraled from there. 12 years ago, I was diagnosed with a heart condition. I had to give full-time employment. So I started sort of writing about Jack. My idea was I wanted to write a book about Hull's connections to the case, because not a lot of people know this, but there's 14 suspects with links to Hull. There was Ripper letters sent to Hull. There was Ripper letters sent from Hull. There was Ripper letters in London that mentioned Hull. So there was a couple of Ripper scares as well where people were arrested for Jack the Ripper-like conduct. So there was a lot of connections to Hull that no one had ever really investigated before. And I started from scratch, really. I went to the archives and went through the old newspapers and spent a lot of time at the old local studies library, which is now gone. And I would travel through to London and go to the National Archives, the London Metropolitan Archives, the British Library, and numerous other resources around the country, and just get as much as I could from each one every time I was there. And I ended up building kind of a big collection of stuff. And since then, I've written a number of books on the case. I've written a number of articles for various magazines. I've written for newspapers. I've appeared on numerous podcasts talking about Jack the Ripper. I've appeared on documentaries talking about the case. And it's just one of those cases where it's just never ending, really. It's such a big, there's people involved in kind of ripperology that study the minutiae. So they'll sit there all day talking about the streetlights in Victorian London and how they cast their shadows. And other people will look at the police beats and where they went and what time they would have got there. And, there's all different aspects. And for me, the Victorian era is fascinating. The language, the social classes, the kind of poverty, the kind of crime and criminals and how they were dealt with. And I just found the whole thing fascinating. So this year's the 130th anniversary.
It is indeed. I'm going to come to that when I start talking about the victims.
So it's quickly becoming sort of popular again, if that's the right word.
I don't think it's ever been. I genuinely don't think it's ever been unpopular. I think it's. I mean, I've always had a fascination with the psyche behind serial killers. So, and I started learning about Jack the Ripper probably when I was about 12 or 13 as to who he was, and I found it quite sort of amazing that this we say man, but there's obviously loads of different theories as to what Jack the Ripper actually was. Some more out there than others. But it kind of is. I think it's almost like he's for people who are interested in serial killers, he's serial killer 101, because he was kind of the first. In a way, he's even though there would have been killers beforehand, and the fact that the term serial killer wasn't even coined until the 1970s, and I think that was the FBI that coined it, wasn't it? Their behavioural science division. But it was one of the things, actually. I mean, you were mentioning how you sort of started reading into it. Talking to Andy Mercer, who was due to be our guest tonight, but scheduling difficulties and everything else, Mike, like the star he is, stepped in to help me out. But Andy says it's because Jack the Ripper was seen as being one of the first noted serial killers. Another friend of mine who's very into serial killers, Mark Hughes, who runs the Fright Nights investigative group, he thinks it's because of a lot of the darkness, like you're saying, about the Victorian history, and he's probably is the first serial killer that most people ever hear of, because it's so sort of in the public domain. Why do you think people have such a fascination with Jack? Where he's not the worst ever serial killer. He's not the only unknown one. I mean, you've got the Zodiac Killer from the 1960s. He's still unknown. You've got the Hammersmith nude murderers that they renamed him Jack the Stripper, who killed prostitutes, I think, in the 1970s. You've got the Cleveland torso murders that I talked about with Carlo Zizic when I did the show on the Death Car back in the 1930s. Then you've got the Black Dahlia. Still nobody knows who killed her, Elizabeth Short. So, and these ones, I mean, the torso killers were probably worse than what Jack the Ripper did. But why do you think people have still got this absolute fascination with Jack?
It's weird. I think, like you say, a lot of it's because of the era. A lot of it's because of kind of who he was, or who she was, or who they was. The whole mystery behind the identity keeps bringing people into it. Not a week goes by when I don't get an inbox from someone who's just come into the scene and they've just started studying and they've got their own theory. And a lot of it is, there's so many books released every year, and a lot of it, people will pick up a book and read that particular book, and from the back of that will then have their suspect for life. And they'll become kind of blinkered, and they won't read other books, or they'll ignore the other books, or they won't listen to the theories, and they become really passionate. And when you kind of show them that, maybe the person they thought was Jack quite possibly wasn't, because, there's historical reasons or these historical documents to back up that, they become quite angry, and it's weird. I mean, it's like a few years ago, I suppose the big names years ago was James Maybrick when the Maybrick Diary came out. That was a big one that attracted a lot of people to the case. In more recent years, Walter Sickert has resurfaced. He was a suspect that's been doing the rounds now for, best part of a century. He keeps popping up in various different theories. But Patricia Cornwell, she used him as her suspect. So that attracted a lot of people to the case. And then more recently, we've seen sort of H.H. Holmes has been attracting people to the case again.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of kind of big names that keep coming out of the woodwork and attracting people to it. And they get involved and start studying and these particular suspects. But at the same time, you've got some of the smaller suspects that don't perhaps get as much limelight, and they just keep kind of plodding on in the background, and people will discuss them and talk about them. But I think it's just the entire spectrum of this case is so big. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of different small aspects, and people are quite eager to research these aspects. So you'll get people coming to the case who are interested in Victorian females' fashions. So they will come to the case and talk about fashion. I know there was one lady who was interested in female rights at the time. There was another gentleman who was involved in music halls at the time, come because of the passion for Victorian pubs. And then, of course, the East End as well was such a fascinating place. You had sort of the Cockney language, so you get people coming who are interested in the Cockney language. So there's all these different aspects that sort of attracted people. And then, the true crime buffs will come and they'll sort of look at it. And, in the years that I've spoken to thousands of people regarding this case, from, kids at school who I've been into lecture to, because in Britain now it's in they study it in the curriculum, Jack the Ripper, as part of the history curriculum. Yeah, in secondary schools now, they do Jack the Ripper. I think it's in year 3.
Oh, that's
or
all right.
4.
Then my 8-year-old, when he finally goes up to secondary school, he's going to ace that part.
Yeah, well, they discuss it. So I know a lot of schools. A lot of schools take their kids to take the students down to London for the Jack the Ripper tours and stuff like that.
Oh, my kids will ace that bit then if that comes up when they're doing it.
So and I've talked to these kids and they've given me their suspects and their theories, and it's nice because they're new to all this. They've got fresh eyes. They're not swayed by anything. And then I've spoke to police officers. I've spoke to scientists, and and people from all over the world. I've dealt with companies from America and Australia and New Zealand, and they've all got their own little theories and stuff like that, and their own ideas, and it's fascinating. It's and it's one of those cases I don't think it'll ever get solved. I don't think it'll ever disappear.
It doesn't. I actually don't want it to get solved. I think it would spoil it.
I think the conversation will just continue and continue and continue. And I think that attracts people as well. The fact that it is now it's like a community. They do regular meetups and conferences, and there's a lot of user groups online where people can go and talk about the case and talk about suspects and things like that. It's massive. It really is massive.
I know that when I've sort of talked to people and I've sort of said, I'm going to be talking to a ripperologist tonight or whatever, they're like, a what? A Jack the Ripper expert, and they were quite amazed that it's almost like Jack the Ripper's got its own cult around it.
Yeah,
I suppose.
Yeah.
But when we look at what the Ripper did and what the links are to, in my view, the paranormal and the supernatural and everything else, there's the 5. I can never pronounce this word. Canonical. 5.
Yeah.
So you've got, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of these, Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly, who was discovered almost 130 years ago to the day, on the 31st of August. You've got Annie Chapman, who was discovered just over a week later in the September. Elizabeth Stride, who was on the 30th of September. That was the double header that night, because you also had Catherine Eddowes, who was discovered that night as well. And then Mary Jane Kelly on the 9th of November. Now, the first thing I notice on this is the dates seem quite regimented.
Yeah.
When I look at the dates. So that you've got the 31st of the month, then the 8th of the month, then the 30th of the month, then the 9th of the month.
Yeah.
So that would be the first thing I would look at is those dates. Do we know if they had any relevance?
Well, in terms of the dates, people have put forward ideas about lunar phases and about various holidays and things like that. That's one of the theories that was put forward for those dates. People have suggested that there were important aspects in sort of the astronomical calendar. So they have looked at that aspect. In fact, a few years ago, there was a book written by a lady called Pamela Bell, or Pamela Ball, and she looked at the psychic aspect, and she basically used astrological charts, and she did it for a lot of the victims and a lot of the suspects. She did it for the dates, and she tried to match them up and tried to find a viable suspect from it. And I think she came to the conclusion it was possibly George Hutchinson. So that was interesting. But the problem with that is that back when she'd written the book, a lot of the facts, as it were, weren't entirely factual. So she'd made a few mistakes in the book, and of course that has an effect on the end product, really.
Yeah.
But that was interesting because she kind of used that aspect in her book. And then on the back of that,
at numerology? If numerological aspect.
There was a book written a few years ago. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but this guy was a numerologist.
Yeah.
And it was basically a book about the occult, but he had a chapter on Jack the Ripper, and he tried to link it in with a guy called Robert Johnson Stevenson, who was born in Hull. But again, the facts that he had on Stevenson were wrong. They were historically false. And he tried to use numerology for that, so that was really interesting. But again, that failed.
Because those dates, I mean, there is the one that they sometimes attribute to him that happened on the 7th of August, the Martha Tabram.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that date would fit into... Because I know with sort of serial killers, they tend to repeat on a certain time frame, and then they start to escalate and go more frequently, which you could have almost have... I mean, that the I call it the double-header night. It's probably quite not very polite way of putting it, but I can't think off the top of my head another way of putting it. When he killed Elizabeth and Catherine on the same night. That was quite unusual to then go back to almost his normal... The other thing, not necessarily even supernatural, is possibly ships coming into the docks.
Yeah.
That could have been the other reason.
That's been looked at.
Yeah.
We one of the theories put forward by Trevor Marriott, the old police officer, he suggested that the killer was a gentleman called Karl Feigenbaum. And Feigenbaum was a German seaman who worked the Nord-Deutsche line. And it just so happens that those ships from that line were in London during that period. However, they were also in Hull during that period,
right.
one of our local docks. And we can't prove conclusively whether or not this particular gentleman was actually on board. We can prove the ships were there, but we can't prove he was on board. So shipping movements have been looked at. And in fact, in 1888, at the time of the crimes, people actually wrote to the police and said, have we looked at the ships? And I know they carried out an investigation into the ships on the Docklands and stuff like that. So that was looked at. So that, and then another interesting aspect for me at the time in 1888, a number of psychics crawled out of the woodworks because during the Victorian period, it was kind of the height of spiritualism. So you had that kind of investigative technique that was used, and you had spiritualist groups right across the UK coming together, and they would have seances and have, try and communicate and things like that. And then they would get in touch with the police and say, right, this is what we've got. This is what we've come across. So that was quite interesting. But again, when you read theirs, it's quite vague, and it just sort of says it's a man and he's quite shifty looking and he's of average height and average build, and it doesn't really give us anything to go on. But even with that, what was interesting about that is all of these different spiritualist groups that were meeting across the UK, you would think that they would all come up with the same results. But in actual fact, when they were presenting the results, there were different aspects in each one. So that was interesting because they were coming out with, some would say he was a tall gentleman, some would say he was short, some would say he had dark hair, some would say he had light hair, some would say he was clean shaven. So all these different things were coming forward from spiritualism groups at the time.
Yeah.
So that kind of failed miserably. And then since then, we've had, psychics and mediums trying to tackle the case. And among these, over the years, I'll give you a few examples of people that tried that. In October 1888, there was a guy based in Bolton in Lancashire. He held a seance. And he described the killer as being dressed like a farmer. So that one was interesting. Another one was Derek Okora. Love him or hate him, Derek got involved with the ISPR team. Was the original investigation he did. They produced a documentary on the back of that, which is available on DVD. I think it's called Derek Okora's World. Derek also wrote about it in one of his books. He was taken to the sites, and he said that the murderer was unknown but picked up on a lot of suffering. And I suppose if these ladies did have their inside ripped out, they would have suffered quite a bit. In 2004, he published The Psychic Adventures of Derek Okora, and he said that he picked up on Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. He also picked up on someone called Elizabeth, which we assume he meant Elizabeth Strad. He then picked up on Mary Ann Nichols on Bucks Row, and he claimed that the murderer at that moment in time was a tall man with high cheekbones and connected to royalty. Then a couple of years later, he appeared in an episode of Most Haunted at the London Dungeons. And by this time, the Ripper Diary was doing the rounds. And of course, Derek came up with the fact that it was possibly James Maybury. who had supposedly written the Ripper Diary. Then Most Haunted Live in October 2005, they did a 4-night investigation. And that aired from, first night was from London Bridge, from the Tower Bridge, sorry. Second night was from Commercial Tavern. The third night was from the Clink Prison Museum. And the fourth and final night was from the Blind Beggar. They picked up on George Chapman, who was based at the White Hart, at the top of George
also
Yard.
known as Severin Klozowski.
Yeah. But yeah, they picked up on him, so that was quite interesting. So there's been a lot of attempts over the years, and then other people, I believe Colin Fry's written about it, and Tony Stockwell, a few other psychics got involved over the years. And then more recently, one of the funniest ones I read was a gentleman involved with past life regression. And he's based in Beverley in East Yorkshire, and he claimed that he spoke with a lady who was reincarnated Mary Jane Kelly, and she gave him information about the case. But the problem was she got information wrong. And I actually emailed him and said, I believe you've got this wrong.
Right.
And it kind of shows that maybe this lady's not Mary Kelly. Maybe she's watched too many shows or read too many books. But the information presented at the time is different to what she was presented. And it's weird as well, because through the years I've been contacted by at least 7.
Okay, so sorry about that. This is going to sound a little bit disjointed, but we just had a bit of a technical difficulty there with the recording. Power went out in Hull. Someone had forgotten to put 50p in the electricity meter up near the Humber, obviously, and we lost everything. But we're back. Mike's back, aren't you, Mike?
I'm back now, yeah.
Good, yes. And what we were talking about, you were saying that you'd had there was contacts from at least 7.
Over the years, I've been contacted by at least 7 individuals, all of them female, all of them claiming to be reincarnated Mary Kelly.
Right.
And it's weird. It adds to that sort of aspect of the paranormal. Is we often think of sort of regression and all this sort of stuff, and who these ghosts were and things like that. And in this case, surely if one person comes forward, but having 7, and they're all still alive at the same time. So to me, that's quite impossible. But it's quite interesting because they all have different spins on it. And, if people come to me, I'll always listen to the stories and stuff, and I find them quite interesting. So that's an interesting aspect. And on the other side of that, we've talked about psychics already. We've talked about how they were involved in the case at the time, but how they were involved in later years. The other aspect is, of course, the ghost stories connected to the case.
I was going to come on to that.
Yeah, these are fascinating. They've interested me for many, many years. But one of the most interesting ones for me is that on the morning Mary Kelly was found, Caroline Maxwell actually claimed to have seen Mary Kelly in the street and said she was throwing up. Now, people have said, could Caroline Maxwell been mistaken? But then the other option is, could this have been a ghost? And so this aspect, straight away, pretty much at the time, this story was being put around that it was a possibility that it was a ghost. Now, in later years, from about 1929, Leonard Matters released a book about Jack the Ripper. And he went down to Miller's Court and spoke to the people that still lived in the area. And he spoke to a man, an elderly gentleman, who said that he knew that Miller's Court was haunted by Mary Kelly. In 1959, another lady came forward called Mrs. Little, and she said that in Miller's Court, there was a picture on the wall of the crucifixion, and when they moved the picture, there was a bloody handprint. And they kept cleaning it, but the bloody handprint came back, so they put the picture of the crucifixion back up. So there's all these stories, and that's just Mary Kelly. There were stories of the other victims as well. People were reporting for years and years afterwards on Bucks Row, which is today Darewood Street, that there were, they'd seen this lady dressed in Victorian dress laid by the pavement, and she was emitting a strange glow.
Yeah.
People had reported hearing screaming. and people with horses had said that their horses had sort of pulled away from the spot. The nostrils would flare, their ears would lay flat on the head. Dog walkers said their dogs would act strange in this area. So that was the Nichols murder. Then on to Annie Chapman. There was reports of people seeing a lady dressed in Victorian dress walking down the street with another man, and they'd vanish into a doorway, which was where number 29 Hanbury Street would have stood. People have also reported in the building what is there today, Truman's Brewery, they'd reported seeing a woman dressed in Victorian clothing walking through the site on the night. So that's been quite interesting. Mitre Square is particularly interesting because this is the site of Edo's murder, which was quite a disturbing murder. It was done in the middle of the street. It wasn't kind of locked away in a door in a house.
And hers was also the night of the double header.
It was, yeah. It was
the
night of the double event, yeah. So this one's particularly interesting because people have reported seeing in the corner where she was killed a body. One of them was a medical student, and he said that when he walked over to it, he got to within 15 feet of it and it vanished. So a lady walking across the square said she'd seen a bundle of clothing. She went over to assist, thinking it was possibly someone drunk. And when she got there, they disappeared. But one of the most interesting ones for me, a few years ago, there was a French author called Philippe R. Welt, and he released 3 books about Mary Kelly. And his theory was that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper. Walter Sickert painted Mary Kelly and knew her in life, and Walter Sickert had killed her. And he claims to have been shooting footage in Mitre Square when you see this. It looks like someone smoking, if I'm honest. But you see this smoke move across the camera, and he pauses the footage at that point and says that it looks like the outline of a piece of painting that Sickert had painted, and therefore this ghostly figure must have been Mary Kelly flying across Mitre Square, which to me doesn't make sense because why would she be there and not at Miller's Court?
Yeah.
So that one's quite interesting. But then, I mean, over the years, there was a number of authors that released books, and they all sort of touched on this sort of aspect of it. James Tully, in 1987, in one of his books, mentioned that he felt the presence of a female who he believed was Mary Kelly. John Morrison was an author. He told Peter Underwood, another author, and very well known in the paranormal community, being an investigator of ghosts. John Morrison said he went to the grave of Mary Kelly and felt some sort of connection with her, some sort of psychic connection. So that's interesting. And then, of course, you had people reporting Jack the Ripper himself. Visitors to the old Bull and Bush in the 1980s claimed that there was a dark presence in the bar, and they said that they'd seen it in the corner, sitting in the shadows, and people had gone on and said that this was Jack the Ripper and he was hiding from view. Another one is that supposedly an eyewitness had seen a man dressed in black and carrying a bag scurrying along Whitechapel High Street. He went behind some advertising boardings. The eyewitness went to look where he'd gone and the man had vanished. So there's a lot of these kind of ghost stories. There's been a lot of TV shows over the years that have kind of dabbled their toes into that side of it and tried investigating it. And I know when I worked on Paranormal Lockdown with Nick Roth and Katrina Weidman, before we actually filmed the show, we spent about 20 minutes talking about stuff, and they obviously knew what I'd done and my research and stuff like that. And it turns out that Nick Roth and Katrina are both massively interested in the Jack the Ripper case. Yeah. So we spent a lot of time talking about Jack the Ripper and the murders and the theories, and that was interesting. And again, when we shot Most Haunted, Carl of Most Haunted is a massive true crime collector, and he was talking about the case, and we chatted about suspects and things like that. So that was really interesting, and it's just an ongoing thing. People always want to talk about it. It's still really, really popular.
I think my interest in it isn't so much the killings, isn't so much the fact it's unsolved. It's more of the social aspect of it.
Yeah.
It's the fact that Victorian England was very specific. The characteristics around Victorian England were very specific. The fact that the East End was a slum, basically, and the amount of women that did resort to going on the game to try, and older women as well, like women in their late 30s and 40s. You know, women that you wouldn't expect to do it, and they were seen as old then. You know, 40, 41, you're a, you know, OAP sort of job. And that's what I find. I also find this, as I said to you earlier, it's the psyche of serial killers I find fascinating. I mean, I think most people know, you know, the five canonical five that people talk about. Sorry, if anyone can hear that, it's my kids kicking off in the background. You know, the Mary Ann Nichols, the Annie Chapman, the Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Have I forgotten anyone? Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. No, it's the five. Because the reason I keep mentioning their names is I think a lot of people focus on Jack the Ripper, the killer. Yeah. But they were victims. There's victims who have still got family around today. And I think people forget them. I think people don't give them the remembrance. They're fascinated by this what could be perceived to be an evil son of a bitch, really. And they don't think about these 5 real women who were brutally slayed. So I'm not going to talk about the way they were killed. It's but one of the things I do want to sort of look into is that the MO was, well, it was a bit strange, you know, the way he took the organs out, the way he, all of that. And I can almost understand why some of the theories linked it to occult or satanic kind of ritual. Yeah. But what I really want to ask you, before we start talking about some of the actual suspects, some of the main ones that I've sort of had come up when I've been doing my research, why do you think he stopped as abruptly as he started? Or do you think he did?
This is the all-important question, really. I mean, anyone with a suspect has to look at that fact that, you know, for all intents and purposes, these murders stopped. There's some that believe that he never stopped. Obviously, if you believe things like, you know, the H.H. Holmes theory, Francis Tumblety theory, you know, he went to America and continued in America. If you believe that Frederick Bailey Demon was Jack the Ripper, some people believe he went to Australia and killed in Australia.
No, I don't. There was murders in that one.
There was murders in France. You know, there was other murders around the world that were very similar. And then also in Whitechapel as well, after Mary Kelly, you had Rose Myler, Alice Mackenzie, the Pinchin Street Torso, and Francis Cole. You know, so there was a possibility that he was still around. You know, and then people will say that, you know, it could be that he was arrested for something else. It could be that he died. I know in one of the royal conspiracy theories, Netley, the coachman, was killed in a coach accident. You know, Sir William Gull had a stroke in 1887, and after 1888, he'd pretty much given up the ghost. And there was all these different stories for different suspects. You know, James Maybrick died in 1889, and you know,
wasn't he killed by his wife or something? Or he killed by his wife's brother or something?
Arsenic was the case. His wife was eventually released from prison. Yeah. But yeah, so, and then there were suspects that were sent to prison. There were suspects that were sent to the asylums. Yeah. You know, so there's all these different stories around, and I honestly couldn't tell you why he stopped. No. And like I say, he stopped because there was stuff going on afterwards as well. But it seemed for everyone on the outside looking in that by November 9th, 1888, the investigation was being wound down. And we know for a fact that the investigation was still open in 1988. It was still classed as an open case. You know, and I don't think, well, you know, stuff's gone missing over the years, various files from the archives and stuff like that. There was a massive file on the suspects, and this was available in the late 1970s, early 1980s. This was in the National Archives. And this was open to the researchers who worked on the Michael Caine TV show. And it was also available at the time when Stephen Knight wrote The Final Solution, which was about the royal conspiracy. And then this file vanished. this important suspect file that named a lot of the suspects disappeared, and no one's seen it since. So there's a possibility that something's lying about in someone's shed or loft or hidden away somewhere that we've just not found that vital piece of evidence. Yeah. One of the things I've been working on at the moment, a few years back, I was contacted by some gentlemen. I'd done a lecture in Beverley, which is a town on the outskirts of Hull. This is the town where Frederick Bailey Demon got married bigamously, second wife. And I was doing a lecture there at the archives in Beverley, which is where I found a lot of my research. And an elderly gentleman approached me after the lecture, and he told me that his family were serving police officers for 3 or 4 generations. And as such, they'd collected newspaper clippings and official files from various cases in my region, in Yorkshire. And they asked me if I'd like to take a look. So I said, yeah, sure. So, anything to do with true crime, I'm fascinated by. I popped round to their house, and lovely big house, and we sat in the conservatory, and they had this massive collection of almost like, they were like big Victorian scrapbooks. Right. And when we opened them up, they were full of newspaper clippings, and a lot of these were about Jack the Ripper. And, I sort of said, I'd love to transcribe all these and turn it into a book, because I've never seen any of this stuff before. And the guy just said, yeah, take what you want. So I ended up taking photographs of everything. And now I'm slowly working through, but there was stuff in there on demon that I'd never seen before. There was stuff in there on John Thomas Sadler, who was the guy who was blamed initially for the murder of Francis Coles. He was blamed for her murder and then subsequently released, but there was a lot of stuff on him, and the reason being is that Sadler worked on a local ship for a local shipping firm, so there was a local interest in him during the trial. So there was a lot of material that these guys had that I'd never seen before. Yeah. And I just thought, wow, and it got, the cogs in your brain start working. You think, I wonder if there's anything else out there that's not being presented to the public or made available to the public. And it was fascinating. Some of the stuff that they had was amazing, and it wasn't just the Ripper stuff. There was other local true crime cases, and they had loads of old newspaper clippings and stuff that obviously at the time their ancestors had been involved in and done a bit of reading and a bit of research. So there was handwritten notes from ancestors about things like Jack the Ripper, and it was awesome, to go through that. Yeah. And I often get people contact me and saying, would you like to take a look at this? And one of the weirdest ones was a gentleman sent me a photograph of a house he was working on. And the house was a brick construction, but the interior of the house was kind of wooden sort of wainscoting inside the house. Mm-hmm. And it was all going rotten. So they pulled it all down, and behind it was this message painted on the wall. And it just sort of said, Jack the Ripper was here, and it had a date on it, and he sent me a photograph and said, what do you make of this? And I get stuff like that all the time. And I think obviously that was obviously some sort of practical joke. But it's so interesting. And you do wonder what's left out there and what gaps it can fill in our investigation.
Well, the thing is, you never know, as you're saying, about all the stuff that might lie uncovered in someone's house, what people have put into the eaves of old buildings, or what's fallen down floorboards, and it's only when those houses maybe get restored or even pulled down that some stuff might get found. You may not even know what you're holding is a vital piece of evidence. One of the things, I've been reading quite a lot in the run up to doing this show. One of the things I noticed is an awful lot of the very serious suspects that ripperologists seem to look at are all Eastern European. When you George Chapman, who was actually, his real name was Severin Klosowski. You've got Aaron Kuzminski. You've got possibly Nathan Kaminsky. Is it Ostrog, Russian naval surgeon, potentially? And there does seem to be a definite sort of, they were Eastern Europeans. Now, do you think, knowing Victorian history, not Ripper history, but Victorian history, that the reason a lot of those people were kind of pushed to the forefront as suspects is because they weren't English?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, Whitechapel at that time was a melting pot of multicultural multi-language, multi-races, all coming into this small area, all on the lookout for where. So, and the docks were just round the corner, basically. So you would have had people coming for work in the area. One of the characters I researched was a guy called Joseph Silver. His real name was Joseph Bliss, and he was a Polish white slave trader. Yeah. And he was in London, supposedly in 1888, knocking about. So he was quite interesting. But there's nothing to tie him into any murders. No. But he was just an interesting character. Yeah. But a lot of these people were kind of emigrating to the UK and settling in that area. Yeah. And then throughout the years, they kind of get pulled into it. And a lot of them came from sort of a Jewish background. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of Polish people there. There was a couple of German people there. So you've got all these people that are different. So it does make you wonder whether or not there was some sort of racial undertone there.
That's kind of what I was insinuating. Yeah. Before we start talking about some of the suspects a little bit further, can I tell you my favourite serial killer joke?
Yeah, go on then.
Right, okay. And this isn't that I'm taking away the seriousness of what happened with the Ripper, but I just love this joke, and it kind of fits into this show. All right. Man picks up a hitchhiker. Hitchhiker turns around to the driver and he goes, "You've taken a chance. How do you not know that I'm a serial killer?" Driver turns around and says, "Well, the probability of both of us being isn't high, is it?" I just like that one. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because they do say statistically at some point in your life you're bound to meet one. Yeah. And I whenever I'm lecturing on this sort of stuff, I always say, statistically speaking, someone in the audience could be. And everyone looks at me weird, and I'm looking upon them with suspicion as well.
When I was about 18, 19, most of the books on my bookshelf in my then house, actually no, even now probably, were either to do with occultism, serial killers, or the paranormal. Yeah. And my then boyfriend said if somebody broke into this house and saw that bookshelf, they'd just go hightailing it straight back out the front door. I was like, yeah, that'll do me.
And it's funny you say that as well, though, because my collection's the same, and my wife sort of says to me it's a bit of a weird collection, and by all accounts it is quite weird. But when people come round, the first thing that they're drawn to are the books, and the first thing they want to do is take them off shelf and have a read, and or they want to talk about them. So people do find it fascinating.
No, I took the boys to the park earlier today, and one of the mums I was there with, she was quizzing me on all stuff like this. So I think there is definitely a fascination there. But looking at some of the, there's an encyclopedia of Jack the Ripper suspects that I've been ploughing my way through, something like 330 odd potentials that there were, including Robert Louis Stevenson, the writer of Treasure Island, because he wrote Jekyll and Hyde, which is farcical, really, that he was one of the suspects. But there's an awful lot in there to plough through. A lot of them were very, very trivial ones, but one of the ones that I sort of spotted was MJ Druitt, who he disappeared after the Miller's Court killings, and wasn't he found in the Thames?
It was, suicide by
December 1888. Now, this guy, I do actually feel quite sorry for him. Whether he was the killer or not, we can talk about that one in a second. He was a very talented cricketer. He worked as an assistant schoolmaster in a very posh school in Blackheath, I think it was, while he was saving up money to train to be a barrister. But he killed himself. But when you start looking into it, what's quite sad about him is that his mum died, mental health problems. She committed suicide, I believe, while she was in an actual asylum. I think his grandmother had mental health problems and been institutionalised. There was a very long family history of mental health problems. And one of the theories behind why he killed himself is that his employment had been terminated very, very suddenly because they discovered he was gay.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Druitt? Because Druitt is meant to be one of the hauntings that people say they see at London Bridge, isn't it?
At London Bridge, yeah. Like you say, I feel sorry for the guy. The problem I have with Druitt is that the first time I read about Druitt was many, many years ago, and the first book I read on him put him down as a suspect. And when you read a book like that, you tend to kind of believe it. And then I read later books on Druitt and discovered that they kind of left out stuff like he was playing cricket the next day, and he was going to be somewhere else the next day, and he wasn't necessarily in London, and he went out and played a really good game, and he didn't look tired, or, so there was all this sort of stuff. And I mean, even at the time, Aberlin dismissed him because he thought the only thing connecting him was the suicide shortly after the murder of Mary Kelly. So it's an interesting suspect. And some years ago, I did a lot of research for a gentleman in America on Druitt, and we discovered there was a rumour that some political party member who was alive when Druitt was alive knew something about Druitt that could potentially be some sort of political hot potato.
Oh, right.
And I basically went looking for this information, and the only thing we could find was kind of hearsay and rumours and speculation, and nothing really concrete that hinted at anything really. So never really chased that one up, but there didn't seem to be anything there linking him to the murder.
So you don't think Druitt did it?
I don't think Druitt did it.
Okay, let's look at another one then. Another one that I think is quite an interesting one. Severin Klosowski, George Chapman.
Yeah,
Poisoned
I mean,
3 women.
It did, yeah. But again, the thing is with this, I mean, you'll know yourself from research into serial killers, the modus operandi. Chapman, when he killed his 3 wives, he killed them with poison.
Yeah.
So for him to change that on these other women is, it's a big move.
Yes.
If he's getting, up until that point, he was getting away with it. So why change it? Mm-hmm. But I mean, there was these stories that he was a barber. He was handy with the knife, sort of thing. And I mean, it's an interesting character. He's another one that is from Poland. Mm-hmm. So he came to the UK and looking for work. And it's a shame because where he was from, the township where he was from in Poland, it was destroyed during the Second World War. It was flattened. So it's not like we can go back there and look for evidence.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, he's an interesting character. If anything, for the triple murder, killing his 3 wives, makes him quite an interesting guy. But because of the
one
MO,
that I wouldn't want to marry.
No, certainly not. Certainly not. I mean, the great thing about Chapman that always interested me was the fact that this guy was well known as a barber, and he practiced on Whitechapel High Street. But he had one of the biggest moustaches of any of the suspects, and it was like, this, why not, cut it yourself? But I know in Hull at Hull University, Philip Sugden used to teach at Hull University, and Philip Sugden wrote one of the big books about Jack the Ripper. Yeah. And George Chapman was his favourite suspect. So that's quite interesting.
Okay.
But like I say, because of the MO, I really don't think so.
Okay. Aaron Kosminski.
Again, this is another interesting one. Again, another Polish Jewish suspect.
And institutionalised from 1891, I believe.
Yes, it was sent to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. The interesting thing for me, however, is there's a newspaper report from, I don't know, it was just after the murders, that says he appeared in the court as a witness. So you tend to think that if he'd appeared in the court as a witness, his sort of lunacy at that point was maybe not set in. The other thing was that there was this, most recently, there was a massive book that came out, and in this book it reckoned that Kosminski was the murderer because they did DNA tests on the shawl of Catherine Eddowes, and at the time the media went crazy for it. Everyone was believing it, and I kind of looked at that and said, well, just hold on a second, let's look at the facts behind what's happening here. first of all, the shawl itself is not actually a shawl; it's a table runner. So this would have been on a dining room table, not necessarily an item of clothing. The other thing is that the shawl was supposedly picked up from the murder scene of Catherine Eddowes by a police officer called Amos Simpson. The problem is Simpson wasn't on duty in that area on the night, so he couldn't have been there to get it. Mm-hmm. So straight away the kind of backstory falls apart. The other thing is the shawl has been tested previously to this, and I know because I worked on the documentary where we tested it, and we did find patches, but at that time we couldn't get anything from them in terms of DNA. The DNA was too degraded. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly you have this test done, and they're not only picking up blood, but they're picking up semen as well. Mm. And the blood belongs to the victim, and the semen belongs to Kosminski, which sounds fantastic because it's you're putting both of them together.
Very fortunate, isn't it? Very sort of coincidental.
But then the problem is, would he have had time to masturbate? And I know that sounds cruel, but would he have had time to do that?
Were none of them sexually assaulted then?
There's no evidence of that. Oh. So, there was no evidence of anything on her at the time when they found the body. So for me, it just seemed a bit implausible. And then the other problem was that it seemed the results were quite rushed. Mm. And when a peer review was done on the DNA tests, it came back that the sample of semen quite possibly could have come from anybody that was from the Polish Jewish population. Right. So it didn't narrow it down to one person, but it kind of broadened the spectrum to all the thousands of Polish Jewish people that were living in the East End of London at that time. Yeah. And then, of course, we can't date the shawl. We don't know when this shawl came from. We don't know where it came from. It just so happens that this turned up in a private collection and was sold for a lot of money. And it's just a weird story in itself.
I think I know with Aaron Kosminski. I mean, I'm not too sure. I've always thought it was a doctor of some sort. That's always been my gut feeling. But with Kosminski, the fact he did end up in Coney Hatch, which Coney Hatch, in its time in the sort of Victorian era, you mentioned the word Coney Hatch, and it was the same as if you mentioned the word Bedlam. It had that kind of fear where nobody wanted to go there. And I believe in 1898, Coney Hatch had 2,500 patients. And they had so many patients. Cause I was reading up on that. I actually stayed in Coney Hatch, not as a mental asylum, but since it's been redone as luxury apartments, I've actually stayed there, not knowing what it was at the time. And I looked into it when I realised that. And in 1903, they built all these wooden huts to try and take on more patients. And in 1903, a fire broke out in these wooden huts. I mean, you'd think wooden huts with psychiatric patients probably isn't the best of choices, and it killed 51 of them. So if he was it, well, he got his just desserts by having to spend time in Coney Hatch in the 1800s. Yeah. Although I think he died there. Don't they believe he died there in 1819 or something?
In 1894, he was sent to Leavesden Asylum. Right. And by February 1919, he died. Sorry, in March 1919 he died, but in February 1919 they actually weighed him and said he was weighing just 96 pounds. But yeah, basically he was admitted for self-abuse, which today is a euphemism for masturbation.
Yes. Yeah.
So I suppose there's a case to be argued there. Would he be considered insane today, or so yeah, I mean, he's an interesting character. And like I say, there's been a lot of work done into his background, and where he came from in Poland, and his family and his parents and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, an interesting character, really interesting. I don't think it was Jack. I don't think there's anything there to suggest he was a murderer.
I think whoever had to have been Jack had to be above average intelligence.
Yeah.
And the reason I say this, I mean, you've agreed with me straight away, but the reason I say this is that he had to pass into places that, although they were dingy, they were dark, the people who frequented them knew them. Does that make sense? They knew the places.
Yeah.
But if you were there all the time, you knew every single nook and cranny of those alleys and those back passages and, pardon the pun, and everything else. So to be able to get in and get into these places, get out without there being so many contradictory witness reports of people being seen with the 5 main murder victims, you had to be pretty damned clever to be able to do that without being detected.
Yeah.
You would also have to be able to blend in, because if you'd had someone who was like royalty in sort of £1,000 shoes walking around, somebody would have spotted that. Those people who lived in those parts of the world, they could spot £1,000 shoes. I know £1,000 shoes, I'm talking metaphorically here, but they could spot things that didn't fit to their... It's a bit like when when you go into a pub that's in like on an estate, and everyone lives in the estate knows it's the estate pub. You go in there by accident as a stranger, everyone's going to notice you.
Yeah, they all stop and look.
Exactly. It was a similar kind of principle. So the fact that whoever it was managed to do these killings, get in, get out, without A, being spotted, without B, leaving any evidence, albeit, at the time evidence collection was quite basic, but still not leaving any evidence, and managing to keep it hidden for 130 years.
The other thing as well we tend to ignore, because we don't look upon this as we look upon it with today's eyes rather than the eyes of the time.
Yeah.
Is back then we had something called beat cops, which would have walked the street, and they would have had a specific beat, which would have been walked down to the minute. So he would have had to study where everyone was at any given time.
Yep.
And these police officers, their beats overlapped. So the killer would have had to watch and study this and see when the window of opportunity was, and who would be where at what time, so that he could get away with it. And that to me indicates that it's someone who's pre-planned this. There's a premeditation there. He knows where he's going to be. He knows the kind of timings and stuff like that. So that's interesting. I know they were saying on Mitre Square, literally, he had a window of opportunity of maybe 10 minutes to get in there and do the deed. And it's interesting because you think any moment a police officer could walk on that corner.
Yeah.
And yet, he seemed to get away with it every time.
Okay. Which brings me on to the book that I've just read, the autobiography of Jack the Ripper, that is meant to have been written by the Ripper. I'm set. You can't see me, but I'm doing this in inverted commas. James Willoughby Carnac. Now, the reason I wanted to mention this is there's been an awful lot. We talked about the Maybrick diaries. We've talked about was it Walter Sickert that Patricia Cornwell reckoned she'd uncovered
a
piece of evidence she'd found, everything. That's who it was. And this book came out, was it 2012? And it supposedly was a manuscript which had been left to the creator of Larry the Lamb, S.G. Hume Bierman. And this guy, James Willoughby Carnac, was the Ripper. It's a good, interesting read. I know you've read it, haven't you, Mike?
I have, yeah. I've got the book.
It's an interesting read as a book on its own. If you, but I personally don't think he's the Ripper. Anyone wants to know my reasons why I don't think this guy is the Ripper, they're welcome to contact me and I will tell you them. But some of them is reading the Encyclopedia of Ripper Suspects at the same time. This book literally seems to be the A to Z of Ripper Suspects characteristics put into one person.
Yep.
It's also very dramatically written. It's very vague on the actual killings themselves. But it's more about, this is where I started in life, this is what happened to me, and it's all very cliched as well, the typical Victorian villain, if you like, sort of dark lank hair, sort of lackluster looking, all of this kind of thing. So if anyone asks me, no, I don't think he's actually the Ripper. Apart from the fact nobody can find any trace of the guy's name either, can they? They can't find any...
Exactly, yeah. Historically speaking, he doesn't exist. And I mean, the other thing as well, they believe it was written in the 1920s, so it was many years after the fact. It was typed up, it wasn't handwritten, so it was done on a typewriter. And and there's just some bits in it that, like you say, they're very over dramatic. When I read it, the first time I read it, and I said this to you the other day, it reminded me of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was written like a diary.
Yeah.
There were certain aspects of it that was written like a diary, and it was almost like that. You get this kind of feel that, it's taking you back to these nights where it was all foggy, and the moonlight was enshrouded with cloud and all this kind of stuff, and it doesn't kind of ring true. When you read it, and I mean, it's an interesting book. At the time, I wrote a review of the book. I did a lot of research into it because I wanted to find out who, James Carnac was, and I looked for James Carnac and James Willoughby Carnac and tried different spellings and all this sort of stuff. Couldn't find any evidence of him in the census, or the electoral rolls, or the polling books, or the trade directories, or the post office directories. Just seemed to be no record of him whatsoever. And I spent several days down at the archives in London and just couldn't see. And it just seemed to me like this was a manuscript for a book that was never published, basically. And it didn't ring true to me as a diary of Jack the Ripper. It was more like a fictionalized version of what people would expect Jack the Ripper to be.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, no, I agree completely. It's a good yarn, is what I said. If people want to read it, it's a good yarn. But it's a bit like when you watch some of the paranormal investigative shows on television. It ain't real. The only one I could find that had any similarities to Carnac was John George Donkin. Is it Donkin? Who was the son of a doctor. Check. He was a drinker. Well, Carnac's dad was meant to have been, in the book, was an alcoholic. And there was something to do. I read something about a doctor's daughter as well was involved there, which again is another part of Carnac's book. But I think it just reads to me as though it's an A to Z of things that have been associated with Jack the Ripper. The Malay side of things, although there was a Malay cook who was one of the ones who was accused. The Jekyll and Hyde links, it's got that in there. It's an interesting yarn, but it's one of those, like I say, I have read the Maybrick book when it first came out. Actually, my then father-in-law bought it for me because he thought I might find it interesting. And I haven't actually read Patricia Cornwell's one yet.
Lucky you.
We see, I like her fiction, and I just thought if I read that, because she's so sort of like, I've spent all this money and I write fiction, crime fiction, therefore I know who the killer's going to be. I just think, how arrogant. You've had some of the best minds in the world trying to work this out, and you reckon you can because you're throwing money at it. Because you write a book about a very clever doctor called Dr. Carl K. Scarpetta. It's a bit arrogant, so I kind of haven't read it. I would if someone gave me a copy. If someone said to me, have a read, see what you think, I'd read it, but I wouldn't go out and buy it. That's the difference.
I've literally got of her book. I have the British edition in paperback, in hardback, the American edition in hardback, the German edition in hardback. Then I have the British first edition in paperback, the American first edition in paperback, and the German first edition in paperback. And then I have subsequent American and British releases after that. And then recently she followed it up with a new one called Ripper, in which she wanted to answer all the questions and criticism that the first book got, and that fails miserably too as well because there's so many mistakes in it and errors and spelling. But and I have copies of it that I've gone through with a pencil and marked out, errors and conjecture and areas where she could have used experts that she had access to as well to do stuff, and she'd failed to do that. And it was such a frustrating, I think at one point she had a paper expert talking about DNA, and at another point she had an art expert talking about paper that people would write on, and it was so frustrating. And it was, I remember when she came to the case, and I thought, fantastic, she's got all this money, she can really do this, and it just left a bad taste in the mouth, really. And she got quite a lot of negative comments from the not just the ripperology community, but also from the art community as well. I mean, at the time, she basically took a number of Walter Sickart's paintings and bought them and then ripped them to shreds in the hope of finding DNA or some sort of smoking gun. Really? And it never happened, and people were shocked. There was a lot of outcry at the time that she'd spent all this money on these old paintings and pulled them apart. And she goes on to address that in the book and things like that. She claims that she never pulled the paintings apart and she was doing it in the interest of science and so on. And when you think, well, what has it achieved, really? It hasn't really achieved anything. We're still sort of stuck in that same boat that we were in before she came along.
So, because this is a paranormal radio station, one of the other things that I've been asked is, do I think the Ripper was a human?
Well, again, that's interesting because over the years, some of the suspects that have been put forward were an escaped wolf from a local menagerie, an escaped gorilla from a zoo. Nice. One of the suspects that came forward in the 1930s was the Loch Ness Monster. So there's if you actually Google it, if you Google Jack the Ripper, Loch Ness Monster, you will find pictures of the Loch Ness Monster in the East End of London.
Sorry.
So there is that aspect. One of the best theories I heard was about a guy who was born just down the road from me, and I wrote a book about him, and his name was Robert Donson Stevenson, and he claimed that Jack the Ripper was a black magician, and he committed these crimes so that he could gain invisibility by making what's known as black candles.
Yeah.
And the idea was that he needed the head of a black cat that had been fed on human flesh for so many days. He needed the horn of a goat that had been found guilty in a British court of law for a capital offence. So already this is sounding a little bit shaky. And then he needs the tissue of a prostitute. And Stevenson translated this from the French book by a guy called Eliphas Levi, very big occultist in the 19th century. And Stevenson translated it wrong. What he actually needed was a tissue, i.e. a cloth woven by a prostitute. And people accused him of being Jack the Ripper. People wrote books claiming Robert Donson Stevenson was Jack the Ripper based on this. And in actual fact, it got his translations wrong. And I mean, the other thing as well, during the murders, Robert Donson Stevenson was in the Royal London Hospital across the road from the first murder scene. And he was in there for over 120 odd days. So he wouldn't have been able to come out, kill and get back in because it was a locked hospital. They had a night watchman who would work on the gates, who would open the gates and close the gates to let people in. The gates are about 7 foot high. Stevenson at the time was in his late 40s. He had gunshot wound in his leg from when he was shot in his leg out at Flamborough. So it was highly implausible and quite impossible for him to get out at night, do these murders, get back in the hospital without being seen and without being covered in blood, and at the same time feeding his cat on human flesh and trying to saw the horn off a goat that had been found guilty in a British court of law. And it just sounds crazy when you think about it, but people believed this for 20, 30 years, and and it just sounds crazy.
So we're going to have to draw the interview to a close shortly, Mike, but we can always do a Jack the Ripper part 2 next year, because I'm doing the Jack the Ripper tour in September it was my birthday last month, and my husband bought me tickets to I've wanted to do this tour for like 20 years, and I'm finally doing it in September. Although not on the 30th, I'm doing it on the 22nd. But putting your money where your mouth is, who are your 3 favourite suspects? Because I know all ripperologists have favourites that they think it could have been. Have you got 3 that you can name?
I don't actually. I'd have to go then with the Loch Ness Monster. The Loch Ness Monster, the escaped gorilla and the escaped wolf. They're my top 3. At the minute, they make more sense than many of the suspects that have been put forward. So yeah, I mean, the Loch Ness Monster could have got out of Scotland, gone down the North Sea, up the River Thames. The docks were close by. It's plausible. So yeah.
There's one you haven't mentioned that it could have been.
Which one's that one?
The Golem of the East End.
Oh, the Golem, yeah, the Golem, yeah. I mean, this was big in kind of Jewish folklore, so that's quite possible. I've not seen the new movie actually. I'll have to get round to watching it. So that's quite possible. Yeah, and someone else even suggested a few years ago that it was possibly aliens. During the 1990s, there was a number of cattle mutilations, and according to some ufologists, there were human mutilations in Brazil and on the North Yorkshire moors, and people have suggested that perhaps the aliens were originally here in 1888 in the East End of London, harvesting organs for their devious deeds, whatever they're doing up in space.
That's a whole different show.
Yes.
That is a whole different show. Well, I know we've only touched the surface on your encyclopedic knowledge on this case. I tell you what, I bet when anyone releases a book saying, I've worked out who it is, and they see, oh yeah, Mike Covell's bought a copy of your book, they're like, oh shit.
I tend to keep quiet. I tend to keep out of it. The ripperology is like any subject. It's like the paranormal. People are so passionate. I've seen this time and time again. People get into arguments and make threats and unfriend each other and block it. So I just stay away from it now. I kind of plod on in my own little world, and I still speak to a lot of ripperologists. I still have time for them, and I still help them out with their research and their books and stuff like that. I still go around all the schools talking about Jack, and I travel through to London 3 or 4 times a year to talk about the case with people and speak at conferences and stuff like that. But I just keep myself to myself, and I just find that I get more work done.
But how many Jack the Ripper books associated with Jack the Ripper have you now written?
Good question. 1 second, I'll count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10. So,
wow. Okay.
Not bad.
Not bad at all. About something that only happened for literally a few weeks in 1888.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, not bad at all.
Well, what else are you up to? Changing the subject, Mr. I know you got a UFO book coming out.
I've got, yes.
Soon?
I can't wait for that. Yeah, anytime.
Cool.
We've got a big UFO conference in Hull in September, and I'm hoping it's out in time for that.
Brilliant. Well, make sure you let us know when it comes out so we can advertise it on the Parasearch pages for you. No problem. Thank you again for stepping in at the last minute to be my awesome guest on this show. I'll tell you what, Andy said your knowledge on this would blow my mind, and it has really, because you've not paused for thought on any of it.
Yeah, Andy's great. I've known Andy for years. He's a great guy, and we often have little discussions and stuff on the case. And,
Andy and I don't have discussions. We have very heated debates.
Like I say, it's a passionate place, is ripperology.
Oh, just about anything. Doesn't have to be about the Ripper. Andy and I, it's a known fact, we have quite heated debates about things. It doesn't mean I don't respect his opinion. I do. That's why I debate it. But no, Andy and I, it is a standing joke that we have quite heated debates about pretty much everything. Yeah, pretty much everything. So, but thank you again, Mike. Thank you again for being my awesome guest tonight on Haunted Histories on Parasearch Radio. If you want to catch up with Mike, he has got a page for his amazing Hull tours, which you can do. He's also got his Facebook page, and he's got books as long as your arm out there that you can go and read, and I would recommend doing them because I have actually read a few before when we did our last show together, when we talked about Hull and what had happened there in World War II, and actually, if anyone was interested, the the Blitz bombs that changed Britain? Is that what it was called?
That was one I worked on.
Yeah, the whole episode was actually on again the other night. So if you want to watch it, head on over to BBC iPlayer, and you should be able to download it, because it was on. Was it Saturday night? It was Saturday night. It was on, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And go and give that one a watch, because that was one of the ones that Mike was involved with.
Yeah, I loved it.
So, I have actually recorded it to watch it again, because I'd only just got back Saturday evening from Normandy, so I was kind of crashed out a bit. But I will be watching it again, because it was a very enjoyable episode. So, well, my thanks go to Mike again for stepping in for tonight's show. Don't forget that Parasearch Radio has shows on 6 nights of the week. You can catch up on all our shows on Spreaker and on YouTube. But until next week, my friends, until we meet again, please, 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 sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web. to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.